A lesson in fairness. Some stories begin in the most ordinary places, on the most regular of days. And yet, they end up revealing the truest parts of human nature. That was exactly what happened one late afternoon at the First Pacific Bank on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. The bank was packed. Long lines stretched from the service counters to the entrance, customers shifting impatiently, sighing, and murmuring complaints under their breath. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes from people forced to wait too long, while employees hurried back and forth, pretending to be busier than they actually were. Behind one of the counters, Brittany Wallace typed away at her keyboard, her expression bored, her patience already worn thin. She had been at this job long enough to know which customers mattered and which ones didn't. And the elderly black woman standing before her? Brittany had already decided she didn't matter. An elderly woman's plea. Linda Carter, a 73-year-old retired school teacher, stood quietly, clutching an envelope in her slightly trembling hands. She had always been independent, never one to ask for favors or handouts. But today, she needed answers. She had noticed unexpected fees deducted from her account. Small amounts, but enough to make a difference in her already tight monthly budget. Living on a fixed pension, every dollar mattered. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her voice steady but gentle. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "I believe there's been a mistake in my account. I've been charged fees I wasn't informed about." Brittany barely looked up. Her fingers continued their mechanical tapping. "Those are standard account maintenance fees," she replied flatly, not even bothering to make eye contact. Linda hesitated, holding out her receipt. "But I've had this account for years, and I've never had these charges before." Brittany sighed dramatically, as if this conversation was an unbearable burden. She finally glanced at Linda with thinly veiled annoyance. With a theatrical groan, she snatched the envelope from Linda's hands, flipped through the papers half-heartedly, and then shoved them back toward her. "It's in the fine print of your agreement," Brittany said, voice dripping with condescension. "If you didn't read it, that's not our fault." Linda blinked, stunned. A few customers in line chuckled quietly at the spectacle. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She had never been one to cause a fuss, never demanded more than her due. And yet, here she was, being treated like an inconvenience, no, like a joke. "Look," Brittany continued, smirking. "If you want to avoid fees, you need to keep more money in your account. That's how banks work." And just like that, the humiliation began. Linda's throat tightened. She wasn't trying to argue. She just wanted fairness. She had been a loyal customer for decades. But as she glanced around the bank, she realized no one was willing to meet her eyes. The same strangers who had been loudly complaining about their own long wait times were suddenly indifferent to her struggle. "I just want to understand what happened," she said, her voice quieter now, but still clinging to hope. The manager's indifference. At that moment, Carl Jensen, the branch manager, walked over. He had been watching from a distance, arms crossed, debating whether this situation was worth his time. Carl believed that time was money. And in his mind, Linda Carter wasn't worth much of either. Clearing his throat, he plastered on a thin, insincere smile. "Is there a problem here?" His tone made it clear he wasn't expecting an actual answer. Brittany straightened immediately, like a soldier at attention. "No, sir," she said quickly, eager to prove her loyalty. "Just a customer who doesn't understand our policies." Carl turned to Linda, his polite smile never quite reaching his eyes. "We have standard fees in place," he said coolly. "If you can't maintain the minimum balance, there's nothing we can do." Linda squared her shoulders, summoning every ounce of dignity she had left. "I've always kept my account in good standing," she said firmly. "These fees just started appearing. All I'm asking is for someone to review them." Carl let out a short, amused chuckle. "What's in the system is in the system. We don't review automated charges." Then, the final blow. Carl leaned in slightly, his voice just loud enough for the entire bank to hear. "If you can't afford the fees, maybe this bank isn't the right place for you." A sharp silence filled the room. Linda swallowed the lump forming in her throat. Her fingers tightened around the envelope. She had never felt so small. "Enter Vin Diesel." And then, a deep, steady voice cut through the air. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The entire bank fell silent. Heads turned toward the entrance. A man in a black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap stood there. At first glance, he looked like any other customer. But there was something about him. His posture. His voice. His presence. It made people straighten up. Carl turned slowly, irritation flickering across his face. And who are you to question how we handle our customers? The man took a few steps forward, removing his cap. Gasps rippled through the bank. Vin Diesel. Yes, that Vin Diesel. The Fast and Furious star. The action legend. The man who had played some of the toughest, most fearless characters on screen. And now he was standing in the middle of the bank, staring Carl Jensen down. Carl's confident stance faltered. Mr. Diesel, I. Vin raised a hand slightly, cutting him off. His voice was calm but firm. It doesn't matter who I am, he said. What matters is why you're treating this woman like this. Linda turned to Vin, eyes wide with disbelief. Carl cleared his throat, scrambling to regain control. Sir, this is none of your business. We have policies in place, and this lady doesn't meet the requirements. Vin tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he asked, policies, or an excuse to humiliate someone who's just asking for fairness? A few customers murmured in agreement. Brittany, who had been so confident earlier, now glanced nervously at Carl. Vin turned back to Linda, his voice gentler now. What exactly is the problem? Can you show me what's going on? Linda hesitated for a moment before handing him the envelope. He took it carefully, scanning the documents inside. After a few seconds, he looked up at Carl, his expression unchanged. This is a mistake, Vin said plainly. These charges shouldn't be here. You're going to fix this. Carl opened his mouth, but Vin raised a hand again, stopping him. If it's a mistake, you'll fix it, Vin continued, voice steady. And if it's not? His voice dropped, becoming even more controlled. Then it's going to be a much bigger problem for you. Carl's face paled. For the first time that day, he looked truly nervous. Would you like me to continue? The weight of the entire room was on Carl Jensen now. The once indifferent customers, who had been too preoccupied with their own frustrations, were suddenly invested, their gazes locked on the unfolding confrontation between the Hollywood icon and the rigid bank manager. Vin Diesel's voice was steady, but there was an underlying intensity that made Carl's throat tighten. This isn't about policies, Vin said, eyes narrowing. It's about respect. He turned toward Linda Carter, the elderly woman standing at the counter, still gripping the envelope with trembling fingers. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something between disbelief and hope. You said these fees weren't here before. Linda swallowed hard, nodding. I've had this account for over 30 years. I've never seen these charges before. They just appeared 2 months ago. Vin's jaw tensed as he turned back to Carl, raising an eyebrow. 2 months ago, huh? His tone was calm, measured. So tell me, why did the maintenance fees on her account suddenly triple? Carl forced a small, nervous chuckle, trying to appear unfazed. But the way his fingers *** tapped against his forearm, a subconscious tick, *** betrayed his unease. Mr. Diesel, I don't think you understand how banking works, he began, his voice carrying an artificial confidence. Fees are adjusted based on corporate policies. If she doesn't meet the requirements for a premium account, she incurs charges. That's how it's structured. Vin nodded slightly, as if considering the explanation. Right. But tell me, Carl, do you review those charges? Do you actually check if they are correct? Or do you just assume the system is always right? Carl hesitated. He knew he was walking into a trap, but there was no easy way out. The system is designed to be accurate, he answered cautiously. Vin exhaled sharply through his nose, letting out a short, amused sound. So you don't check. He glanced down at Linda's paperwork, flipping through the pages quickly. Here's what I see, Carl. A woman who's been banking here for decades suddenly gets hit with fees she was never informed about. When she asks for clarification, she's mocked and humiliated. And now you're trying to tell me it's just policy. Carl's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The customers in the bank were no longer just watching. They were listening. Vin's voice dropped slightly, his words cutting through the silence. That's where you're wrong. His gaze locked onto Carl. You do make exceptions. Just not for people like Linda. A hushed murmur spread through the crowd. A few people shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing they had been on the receiving end of the same treatment. Brittany, the young teller, cleared her throat. Mr. Jensen, maybe we should just... Carl shot her a glare so sharp that she immediately shut her mouth. He was losing control. And he knew it. But VIN. He was just getting started. He turned to the gathered customers, lifting Linda's paperwork like evidence in a trial. How many of you have had unexpected fees show up on your accounts in the last few months? For a moment, silence. Then, a few hesitant hands went up. A middle-aged man in a work uniform. A young woman holding a baby. An elderly couple near the back. More hands followed. Carl's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about Linda. VIN slowly scanned the room, his expression unreadable. So, it's not just her. Interesting. He turned back to Cal, his voice lowering slightly. You might want to think carefully about your next words. Cal swallowed, feeling the walls of his own bank closing in on him. If he kept dismissing Linda, he'd be dismissing half the people in the room. But if he admitted fault, his career could be on the line. VIN didn't give him time to think. Let's check something, he said, motioning toward the computer behind the counter. Since you're so sure the system is accurate, go ahead. Pull up her account. Let's see those fees. Carl hesitated. VIN tilted his head. What's wrong? Thought you said everything was clear for people who pay attention. Carl's eyes darted to Brittany. For the first time, she didn't look at him for approval. She just turned to the computer and began typing. The monitor flickered to life, displaying Linda's account history. VIN leaned in, scanning the information. Then, a slow smile crossed his face. Well, look at that. He tapped the screen lightly. The fees started 2 months ago, right after a change in bank policy. And not just on her account. He turned to the other customers. How many of you have been banking here for more than 5 years? Several hands shot up. Vin's smile didn't fade. And how many of you started seeing new charges around the same time? More hands. The bank was silent, except for the sound of someone shifting uncomfortably near the back. VIN turned back to Carl. You see where I'm going with this? Carl's face was ashen. Mr. Diesel, I assure you, we don't target specific people. VIN held up a hand, cutting him off. You don't? Funny, because based on what I'm seeing, the majority of these new fees are hitting elderly customers. People who are less likely to challenge them. People who might not have the energy to fight back. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That's not policy, Carl. That's a scam. Carl opened his mouth, then closed it again. His pulse hammered in his ears. VIN took a slow step forward, his voice lowering. I don't like bullies, Carl. His tone was almost conversational. And I really don't like people who take advantage of the ones who deserve the most respect. He motioned toward Linda. This woman dedicated her life to teaching. She shaped minds. And you're telling me she doesn't deserve basic decency. Carl was sweating now. And then, he saw it. A young man near the front of the line, phone held high, recording everything. Carl's stomach twisted. VIN followed Carl's gaze, letting out a low chuckle. Yeah, that's right. This is going out there. He took one last step forward. So here's what you're going to do, Carl. You're going to reverse every single one of those charges. Not just for Linda, but for every customer affected. And then, he crossed his arms. You're going to apologize. Properly. Carl's jaw clenched. His career flashed before his eyes. VIN raised an eyebrow. Or, we could see how corporate feels about their branch manager making headlines for defrauding elderly customers. Carl exhaled shakily. His shoulders slumped. Fix it. He muttered to Brittany. She wasted no time. As the numbers on the screen rolled backward, the energy in the bank shifted. VIN turned to Linda, giving her a small nod. That's more like it. Then he folded his arms. Now, let's hear that apology. The weight of the entire room had shifted. Where there had once been silence and hesitation, now there was quiet admiration. Eyes that had darted between the Hollywood star and the man in the stiff suit now remained fixed on Carl Jensen, who stood frozen, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. Just minutes ago, he had been in control. Now, that control had crumbled into dust. VIN Diesel, having said all that needed to be said, pulled his cap back on, tipped it slightly in Linda's direction, and walked out of the bank without another word. The door swung shut behind him with a quiet finality, but the battle he had sparked was far from over. The moment VIN was gone, the dam broke. Customers, once passive, now exchanged murmurs of approval. Some nodded, others chuckled under their breath, shaking their heads at Carl in disgust. The employees behind the counter, especially Brittany Wallace, struggled to process what had just happened. Carl, however, had no time to process anything. His heart pounded as he turned toward Brittany, his voice sharp and desperate. "Shut that down. Now." Brittany hesitated. She glanced between him and the computer screen where Linda's reversed fees were still displayed in glaring confirmation of the bank's wrongdoing. "Sir, I—" Carl clenched his jaw. "Now." But it was too late. A voice from the front of the line broke through the tension. "Already uploaded, buddy. You can't erase this." Carl's stomach dropped. The young man who had been filming finally lowered his phone, a triumphant smirk on his face. Carl spun toward him, his breath ragged. A few seconds ago, he had dismissed Linda Carter as just another elderly woman who wouldn't fight back. Now, his name and face were about to be everywhere. Linda, standing beside the counter, watched it all unfold. She felt something rise in her chest, not quite joy, not quite relief, but something powerful nonetheless. Satisfaction. Strength. For so long, she had been made to feel small. Today, she wasn't. She had spent decades teaching young minds to stand up for what was right, but she never thought she'd need someone to remind her of that lesson. And yet, Vin Diesel had done just that. The young man grinned. "Man, this is gonna blow up. People are gonna love seeing you get put in your place." Carl's pulse thundered. He grabbed his suit jacket, turning sharply toward his office. He needed damage control. Now. But before he could reach the safety of his office door, Brittany spoke up. Her voice was hesitant but firm. "Sir, I think we should report this." Carl froze. Brittany swallowed hard but kept going. "We were never supposed to charge those fees in the first place. If corporate sees this." Carl whirled around, his face bright red. "You think corporate is gonna back some old woman over me?" He laughed bitterly, though the nervous edge in his voice betrayed him. "I've been running this branch for 8 years. They'll—" A sharp ding cut him off. Then another. And another. All around the bank, phones chimed as customers checked their screens. Linda, confused, turned to the young man with the phone. He smirked. "Told you. The video's already spreading." Kyle, his throat dry, yanked his own phone from his pocket. His hands trembled as he saw the screen. Hundreds of shares. Thousands of views. Dozens of comments flooding in. His name. His bank. His behavior. All captured in 4K clarity and unleashed upon the world. A single word escaped his lips. "No." Customers murmured in agreement. Some outright laughed at him. Others shook their heads in open disgust. The power in the room had shifted completely. Just moments ago, Linda had been the one looking down, ashamed. Now it was him. Then, the phone behind the counter rang. Brittany checked the caller ID. Her eyes widened. "It's corporate." Carl snatched the phone from her hands. He straightened his posture, clearing his throat before pressing the device to his ear. "Yes, this is Carl Jensen." The voice on the other end was curt and cold. "Mr. Jensen, we need to talk. Now." Carl turned on his heel and stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. After the storm, a strange silence settled over the bank. The tension was still there, but it was different now. Not fearful. Not anxious. Expectant. Like the moment after a storm, when people step outside and begin to assess the damage. Linda exhaled deeply, suddenly aware of how tired she felt. But it was over. She looked around. Customers still had their phones out. Some whispered, some smiled. But their expressions had changed. Then Brittany turned to her, shoulders less rigid, her voice softer. "Mrs. Carter, she hesitated. "I just want to say I'm sorry for how I spoke to you earlier." Linda studied her, then nodded. "I appreciate that." Brittany's fingers twisted together, nerves still evident. "But she wasn't done. And I'm really sorry you had to come here to fight for something that should have been yours in the first place." That was the real apology. The bank's doors swung open. For a brief moment, everyone turned, almost as if expecting Vin Diesel to walk back in and finish what he started. But it wasn't him. It was just another customer, a woman with 2 children, looking as exhausted as any working mother on a Friday afternoon. Linda smiled. Vin Diesel didn't need to come back. He had already done what he came to do. The aftermath. Days later, the impact hit like an earthquake. The video spread faster than anyone had expected. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. Within 24 hours, the bank's headquarters released a statement. An internal review was launched. By the end of the week, Carl Jensen was removed from his position. Corporate cited failure to uphold company values and multiple customer complaints. Complaints that suddenly gained traction following the viral video. Brittany was placed under review. But after testifying against Carl, admitting she had been pressured into following unethical instructions, she was allowed to keep her job. Most importantly, every single customer who had been unfairly charged had their money refunded in full. A letter from Los Angeles. Linda watched it all unfold from the comfort of her home. She never thought a simple trip to the bank would turn into something this big. But one morning, an envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't from the bank. It was postmarked from a film studio in Los Angeles. Inside was a handwritten note. Mrs. Carter, you didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you. Hope this makes you smile. VIN. Tucked inside was a signed Fast and Furious poster and a personalized invitation to one of Vin Diesel's upcoming movie premieres. Linda laughed. She ran her fingers over the signature, shaking her head in disbelief. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt valued. She felt unstoppable. And as she stepped outside, taking in the fresh air, she knew. The world wasn't perfect. But when you fight for what's right, sometimes, the right people show up to fight with you.